Okay, hold on. Still dealing with tech. I'm hearing Perry talking to somebody there on the other screen. All right, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Can you see the screen share that says Micah chapter 6? Thumbs up, and you can hear me. Okay, this is all good. We are now going to get underway. Obviously, we have some things to think about by way of review. And so here's a quick, as usual, where are we going today? And yes, we're going to review the history. I'm going to use that graph that I've been using all along, chart to do that. We want to pick up with some of the most salient theological issues that have been tracking with us, or we've been tracking them. And then I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about Micah's rhetoric, his oracles. We've said some things about that as we've gone along. But we just want to refresh our memories because chapter 6 is particularly compelling in that regard. And then, of course, we want to do the highlights of chapters 1 through 5 as well. I see I need to admit some people in the waiting room. This is probably going to happen for a while, folks, so thank you for your
You want me to get off? Oh, okay.
We're going to be using the term lawsuit throughout. We've mentioned that already, but in chapter 6, we're going to see it particularly. So as we spend most of our time on chapter 6, that's the framework we're going to be thinking about. So by way of the history, first of all, I've given you this chart before. I've actually expanded it out a little bit more this time. We do see our significant prophets that are right around that turn of the century between the 700s. So 701, a very critical date. And we see, in addition to Micah and Isaiah, just prior to them, Jonah, Amos, Hosea. Pausing on this just because we want to make a note of the name Ahab. If you've done your assignment for today, you're aware that we have Ahab and Omri mentioned at the end of the chapter. And so I want us just to note that here we've got them. Ahab is the major figure here. Northern Kingdom, one of our most hideous northern kings, and well, the marriage to Jezebel is, of course, a significant figure all the way along. So we're going to come back to that eventually by the end of chapter 6. We also want to mention our theological components here. We've talked over and over again about the covenant. And I know that's a really familiar concept to us, but it's particularly important in this chapter because God is going to use the term my people. My people. And of course, that's pregnant with all sorts of implications. They're his people. And as I've noted for you here, it's God's doing mighty acts and uttering his prophetic word for the sake of his people, to keep that relationship vibrant and true and so forth. And so part of that covenant, part of the articulation of the covenant at Sinai was the instructions for them in terms of how to be pleasing to their covenant Lord. And then, of course, part of it articulates blessings for their obedience, chastisements in order to bring them back to him for disobedience. And as we're going to see a little bit later on, generally speaking, with regard to these covenants, heaven and earth were called as witnesses. Through Micah, the Lord's going to use a different expression. It's going to be the mountains and the hills. But notice witnesses were generally heaven and earth. Coming back to our theological overview here, obviously, as we've said over and over again, as we've been working through Micah, God called his prophets specifically to speak into historical circumstances where those people were not being obedient to the covenant stipulations. And therefore, the prophets were called to bring charges within this lawsuit covenant context against the disobedient people. Very often, and again, we're going to see it today, towards the end of chapter 6, that there would be chastisement measure for measure. We've seen that over and over again. We saw it starting in chapter 2, but those chastisement warnings are going to alternate with promises for restoration. So those are our theological reminders. Just as I said a moment ago, a word or two about how Micah is speaking, because it's fascinating stuff. As Perry said right from the get-go when he was doing chapter 1, the last part of chapter 1 is full of word plays. And I don't just mean puns. Micah does interesting things, wonderful things, things with words that are really significant to help his audience put this all together. We saw it in chapter 2 when the prophets were talking about dripping as opposed to prophesying. That word was full of meaning as well. So we're going to see word plays that are part of this, particularly significant with regard to chapter 6. Our understanding, the reader's understanding, Micah's audience's understanding of their historical background was absolutely essential. Micah is going to allude to things, and we're going to see that as we get into especially chapter 6, verses 6 and 7. Strong allusions in terms of historical and theological background. We also noticed as we've been going through these first 5 chapters that, you've got to really be paying attention, because there's going to be shifts of focus and shifts of time frames. We saw that especially when we dealt with chapter 4, and Perry saw it with chapter 5 as well. You have in the last days, or in the latter days, you have but now, you have in that day, and those expressions are indicating something about how this is all going to unfold. Well, I guess I've said this all along, but we're going to see it especially with chapter 6. At least for me, and I have to qualify this, probably for really good Hebrew scholars, this isn't difficult, but it's difficult Hebrew, but I'm going to try and give you, and I'll say where this is, painfully literal translations. Sometimes they're very stilted, sometimes they're a bit awkward. There are places, depending on what translation you're reading, that you're going to see little notes at the bottom of your translation that says, the Hebrew here is uncertain. But, translators have to make a choice. And so there will be places where I'm going to be making notes of that, and it may change a little bit how we think about some things. So be ready. Here we go with our review, first of all. Chapters 1 through 3. Again, just to get us all on the Micah page. As Perry talked about chapter 1, we saw Micah starting with the transgressions of both Samaria, i.e., that's the northern kingdom capital, as well as Jerusalem. But we saw towards the end of that chapter that one after another, major cities in this Shephelah buffer zone area between the coastal plain and Jerusalem falling. Sennacherib, as I note for you, brags about getting 46 cities and destroying them in Judah. Chapter 2, we saw really dreadful violence, injustice over and over again, and measure for measure responses. There's one of those hopeful moments, verses 12 and 13 at the end of chapter 2, where we have a reference to God as shepherd, God as king. It's fleeting, but it's there, and it's pointing ahead, of course. Chapter 3, returning back to the fact that the leaders, all of them, prophets, priests, etc., happier about pursuing their own gain and being quite brutal in doing it, and worst of all, presuming that they were safe because they had God's house in their midst. So chapter 3 ends with this really awful prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem, to the point, as we said before, later Jeremiah is going to reference Micah on that very passage to the effect that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. By way of contrast, chapter 4 starts out with, in the latter days, many nations are going to stream to Jerusalem to learn and walk in the Lord's ways. What a contrast. The resultant transformations we're supposed to see. Now, having said that, we have one of those but now midway through chapter 4, because Micah will describe the current distresses. Chapter 5, the promised shepherd, king, and ruler from Bethlehem. This is the section, that chapter that Perry dealt with last time. He talked about the remnant, and Israel as a remnant among the nations, represented on the one hand by dew, or on the other hand by a lion. And we talked about the implications of that. And then the end of chapter 5 is repeated over and over and over again, the word, I will cut off, I will cut off, I will cut off. And many of those have to do with God's cutting off idolatry. That is our quick review. What I've done in this next section is to give us a sense of chapter 6 at large. So here's an overview, and then we're going to try and pull this apart piece by piece. I can't emphasize enough the importance of thinking of this as a relationship agreement, and therefore lawsuit is going to be a term that keeps coming up over and over again. Whoops, didn't mean to get rid of that quite so soon. There it is. And we'll address that as the introductory statement with the charges and the witnesses called. We see God as prosecutor and the people as defendants in this. And then I've got highlighted covenant history lesson, because even though it is really brief, just verses 4 and 5 of chapter 6, and we're going to come back to them in a moment, but it's presumed that they know, the people are supposed to know what it is God has done for them. And that will be, of course, his declaration in this lawsuit, because they're supposed to be responding to that. As a result, they ask questions, verses 6 and 7. How are we to approach and bow in submission to God? And drawing verses 6 and 7 and their questions about how to approach, some scholars call this an entrance liturgy, then God will respond. What is good and what God requires? And of course, as we think through the book of Micah and we think through chapter 6, this is the verse that probably jumps right out at us more than any other. It's probably one we've memorized, but we get to see it in context today, because that's going to help us, I think, understand even more strongly the implications of that verse. There's an interesting transition verse after verse 8. Again, we want to get the whole context here, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, the rest of that chapter are talking about some of the accusations and consequences. So what we're doing from this point on is taking one or two, in some cases 3 verses at a time. I'm going to give you the translation, and I want to pause a little bit for this just to soak in, if you will. And then underneath it, or following it, depending on how the spacing on the slide works out, some observations, and also, I think, well, maybe if you have some reflections, things you want to say, things you want to ask, bring them in as we go along. So here's verse 1. Hear what the Lord is saying. Rise. Engage the mountains in a lawsuit. You remember we said a moment ago that generally speaking, the witnesses were heaven and earth. But the expression here is different. It seems to indicate that the mountains themselves are going to be part of this. Let the hills hear your voice. So just a couple of comments. The rest of this segment from God as prosecutor is going to be addressed to the people. But this verse is seemingly talking to Micah himself. Get up and you speak, okay? Engage the mountains in the lawsuit. And I'm sure you've gathered this already, but I'm simply going to say it again as a transition to verse 2. One Hebrew word, it can be both a noun and a verb, short little word, riv is the word, can be translated lawsuit, charge, dispute. And as I said already, that shapes this first section here because it shows up so many times. Here's verse 2. Coming back to our witnesses. Hear, O mountains, the charge, that's the word, of the Lord. And then there's kind of a bracket. Enduring ones, lasting foundations of the earth. Another way, poetic, wonderful way of talking about the mountains. They are there. They are there as silent observers. They're foundational, all right? So mountains, the enduring ones, the lasting foundations of the earth. Hear the charge, because the charge of the Lord, because the Lord has a dispute with his people, and he will contend with Israel. It's one thing to read this. It's another thing to pause for a moment and even begin to realize what it is that's bringing God to this point. Now, we've seen it already, especially as we read chapters 2 and 3 and 5, and we're going to see it again towards the end of this chapter. His people have been terribly disobedient. Again, just in terms of a little bit of backdrop here, as I've already said, and you can look up these passages, especially in Deuteronomy, where we have our covenant shaped again. But Isaiah chapter 1, and remember, Isaiah is a contemporary of Micah, calling heaven and earth to witness what's going on here. Now, I'm not going to wax long on this, but we do have, in the wider cultural context, treaties, arrangements, suzerainty treaties, made between a king, generally speaking, a sovereign, and the vassal states. Lots more to say about that, but for our purposes right now, as those treaties were articulated, there were often witnesses that were called. And you can read through these. In Deuteronomy, we have heaven and earth. In some of these other treaties, we have sky and sea and clouds and heaven and earth and wind and so forth. So lots of natural phenomena are being called in these wider contexts. In the case of God's treaty with Israel, or God's covenant with Israel, he's calling heaven and earth. And just a reminder, when you read, I think it's Psalm 113, but I'm doing this off the top of my head, so forgive me and somebody check me. But it talks about God as seated far above the heavens and the earth, right? So unlike the other cultures where the gods are sort of wound in with those things, our God, our sovereign God, is far, far above those, and those phenomena are called just to be witnesses. So to repeat things I've already pretty much said, these everlasting foundations of the earth, enduring silent observers, but they're called to hear. And although you may or may not like this, I'll try it out on you anyway. Those of you who have been in mountainous contexts and call or sing or something, you know that it echoes round and round and round from those mountains. And those who have seen some of you have, I'm looking at your faces, seen the areas around Jerusalem and those wonderful hills, know that that would be a perfect natural amphitheater almost for hearing this call as well. Well, let's carry on a little bit. We have verse 3. And here's God. God speaking directly now, my people. Just a note, when we get to the end of this chapter, it's going to close with my people. And so we've got kind of a sandwich going on here. But in this case, it's God saying, what have I done to you? What have I done? Fascinating. How have I wearied you? Answer me. And of course, as I've already intimated, in calling them my people, we need to review all the things that have to do with God's covenant and what that means. I'll come back to some of those. And here's a telling thing. God is inviting. He's inviting their accusations. That's astonishing. He's asking for evidence against himself. I'm reminded of I think it's 1 Samuel 12, where Samuel is, the people have asked for a king. And so they have this, Gordon preached on this about 4 or 5 years ago. And Samuel will say the same thing. My people, what have I done? Have I done this? Have I done this? Have I done this? And of course, none of those possible things are things that Samuel had done. And yet the option is there for the people to make accusations. But that actually comes to be an accusation against themselves because they've been unfaithful. God's question, simply again, one of these wonderful rhetorical things. Just as my people shapes this chapter, beginning and end, we're going to have God talking about what it is, asking what it is he's done, and then that will point forward to that segment of verse 8 that we know well, what they should do justice in particular. Well, here is God's beginning declaration. And I'm going to pause just a moment because I want you to think about the implications of bringing up. Generally speaking, when we read that recital of Israel's covenant history, and it's wonderful and it shapes so much of what happens when there's any interaction after their exit from Egypt. But usually it is, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's powerful enough. But this is, I brought you up. And in some ways, there's all kinds of interesting implications there, not least of which is up all the way from Egypt to the promised land. And of course, part of that process is they're having been enslaved and now they've been bought, freed, redeemed. And then he says, I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Well, let's pause for a moment before we do Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. I've already suggested that as Israel's national narrative, this infuses everything in terms of their identity from here on in. And they were expected to know it. When you read that segment in Deuteronomy 29 that I've noted for you there, Moses is saying, I'm saying this not just for you all, but for those who aren't here as well. And of course, subsequent generations, and when the rabbis interpret that, they say that is the groundwork for it saying it's speaking to us too. We were there, no matter how many centuries we are, transcends time, chronological boundaries. We were there. We are there at Sinai, standing at the foot of Sinai. And therefore, this was supposed to have a living, active, transformative effect on them. And so, just carrying on, you read Psalm 78. Each generation was to tell the next generation. I'm going to come back to that when we look at Joshua chapter 4 in a moment as well. But they were to know their covenant history in detail. And you can read Psalms 105 and 106 as examples of this, recitals of what God had done for them. So what have I done for you? Going back to his question. Well, I brought you up from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. I redeemed you. And just to repeat the last sentence there, all these things that God has done, as they're recorded and remembered in the Psalms, i.e. they were sung, as you know, singing helps us remember things, they also included what it is that Israel had done. And usually it wasn't very good, the rebellious acts. God also says, through Micah, I sent you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Now, maybe that's supposed to be a contrast to the current dismal leadership. When Joshua, at the end of Joshua, recites what it is God has done, he's going to name Moses and Aaron. Samuel's going to name Moses and Aaron. We have them as named leaders. I think it's interesting that Miriam is there too. And again, I'm just going to try this out on you, and you don't have to like it at all. But you may remember at the end of Exodus 15, after Moses has sung the song, Moses and all Israel sings the song of their redemption. Then it says, and Miriam picked up, she's called a prophet there, Miriam picked up and she sang it too. And it may be that she's mentioned there because early on, as a prophet, Miriam is helping them sing their history. She's helping them sing, Exodus 15, what it is God has done for them. And there's an interesting transition point in Exodus 15. She's helping them sing what God will do for them. You can go back and look at Exodus 15. So just a suggestion. I have no basis for that other than that suggestion that I just made in terms of linking back to Exodus 15. But it's fascinating to me that Miriam is named in this context. Well, here we are. Let's see where God goes next, or maybe put better, how Micah is going to describe what God has done, thinking in terms of geography. Now you look at that map. Obviously, it's the Sinai Peninsula, but we're going to finish this itinerary in a moment. But here's the way, if someone doesn't know the narratives from Exodus through Numbers and into Deuteronomy, doesn't know those narratives well, you might kind of think, oh, this is what Micah's talking about, right? God has brought them from the house of bondage, and they're going to land up in the promised land. Looks kind of like that. But again, for those of you who have had fun with maps before, and if you've been tracking the book of Numbers with us, well, first they head down to Sinai. And then after a year at Sinai, they're moving up and they're kind of going around that central area of the Sinai Peninsula because that's a really, really barren area. But they're going to go to Kadesh Barnea. And we pause there, don't we? Because Numbers 13 and 14 at Kadesh Barnea, there were some interesting issues. They were supposed to go up and spy out the land and go in, and then, there were 40 years of wandering. And after the 40 years of wandering, they turn and they go, well, around or through or along the border of Edom. We discussed that when we talked about the book of Numbers. And they're going to go through Moab. Now, Micah is going to refer to that. We're going to come back to it in a moment. And then finally, they get into the promised land. Micah's historical allusion is really compressed. But they're supposed to know all this stuff. That's the interesting thing. Let's just look at what it is they're supposed to continue to remember. Not only has God brought them up, not only has he redeemed them from the house of bondage, but here's this word remember, 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 memorize. And notice what comes afterwards. Remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered him. Well, again, that is after that long trajectory past Mount Sinai, past Kadesh Barnea, past Edom, and finally, well, this people is getting a little bit too numerous, and Moab and the Midianites are worried, and so they call Balaam. We've already said these things, but I'm just getting them there in print for you. Oh, and as I was talking to them, I left out Sihon and Og, but that means they got all that area of Transjordan north of Moab and well up into the area that is east of the Sea of Galilee. So no wonder Moab, king of Moab, and the Midianites are a little distressed and call for Balaam. But here's the other thing about the Balaam incident that we need to remember. Here's where general area, because they move around a little bit. Remember, Balak is not terribly happy with what Balaam says, and so he shifts him from mountaintop to mountaintop. But they're supposed to remember that even though Balak offered to pay Balaam well, and there's a long story there, you can go back and review that. Three separate times, the Numbers account in all its detail, and then a reference in Deuteronomy and a reference in Joshua 24, that it was the Lord who turned Balaam's intended curse into a blessing. And that's remarkable. Lots we can say about that. Of course, another reminder, and this brings us back to those Psalms that have recitals of covenant history in its entirety, both with God's provision as well as the people's disobedience. Later on, Balaam, because he wasn't going to get paid, told the Moabite king that he should have his Moabite women, seduce the Israelites to worship at Baal Peor. And we have in Numbers 25 and Numbers 31 how that all comes together, and Balaam is the one who counseled that. Now, we see that, as I said, showing up also as a reference in Psalm 106. A wider curse, but we have a guy named Phinehas, stops what's going on. God continues to go with his people. But that's one of the things that they're supposed to remember, and it comes right after Micah's statement about, I redeemed you from Egypt, from the house of bondage, presuming they knew everything in between. Well, and then continuing on, because they haven't quite got to the promised land yet, here's all the verse says. From Shittim to Gilgal. From Shittim to Gilgal. Now, if these people weren't too up on their history, they might not realize there's Shittim, there's Gilgal, and what do you see in between? Well, a significant crossing, isn't it? By the way, Micah doesn't even include the word crossing. That's why I put it in brackets here, right? They're just supposed to remember from Shittim to Gilgal. So we look back with the Israelites, and we recognize that Abel Shittim is the last named place where they were before they crossed the Jordan. And Gilgal is the very first named place after they crossed the Jordan. In between is crossing the Jordan. And so it's kind of a a cryptic allusion, but they're supposed to know that. And again, when we read Joshua 24, I won't take the time to do it now because we need to move ahead, but it's fascinating that they are setting up those commemorative stones, and specifically so they can remember that they have crossed the Jordan on dry ground, just as they crossed the Sea of Reeds. The equation is made there, and then it goes on, so that you may fear the Lord forever and ever. So that you may fear the Lord forever and ever. And of course, that's something that's going to come up a little bit later on in Micah as well. Well, let's keep going. To close out this first segment, the prosecutorial statement, the righteous acts of the Lord. And the bottom line is, as God closes this down, he's vindicated by his acts on behalf of his people. The righteous acts, the things that he has done for them. Again, as I noted for you, Samuel will talk about that as well. That's the end of that segment. What God has done. It's compressed. And so we have to take the time, as we've just done, to unpack it and realize how full of meaning it is in terms of God's perfect actions on behalf of his people. He hasn't broken the covenant at all. Now, obviously, we're going to move forward into what the people, the defendants, are going to say for themselves, and they're going to talk about some questions that have to do with sanctuary. So, even though this is stuff we know, I want to just remind ourselves, when they were at Sinai, a year at Sinai, lots of things accomplished, shaped into a people, tabernacle built for them, organized, Torah given, covenant established. They experienced God's presence in that tabernacle. And as part of it, when we read through the instructions, they're told in very important, careful detail, by means of sacrifice, by means of a mediatorial priesthood, how to approach their holy God who has condescended to dwell in their midst in the tabernacle, in the most holy place. And so those instructions are really important. That's part of what happened at Sinai. But as you continue to read the instructions at Sinai, obviously, and we can go back to chapters 21 through 23 of the book of Exodus, that's how to live justly in relationship with one another. So both of those things have got to be part of this picture. Okay, just a quick summary. God had gone to indescribably great lengths for them. They're called to answer them, and what's their response? Before we jump into their questions, I'm just going to pose these questions for you. And by the way, I'm going to say them several times because this is an interesting set of questions on the part of the people. And not everybody is in complete agreement in terms of how to interpret these questions. So, possibilities. Some suggest that verses 6 and 7, we're going to read them again in a moment, I'll have them on the screen. They're Micah's sarcastic depiction of people who are posing these questions, but they're insincere. They're making themselves sound like they're really eager to come into God's presence, but they're exaggerating. So one way is to kind of dismiss them that way. Second suggestion that some people have made is that, these people, again, let's think of our history. They're in a position where the Assyrians, and by the way, John Knight asked this question last week, and it's a wonderful one. It looked like the Assyrians are coming from north, they're coming from west. These people are in a pinchers. And humanly speaking, they're in a desperate situation. There are those who suggest that the people are asking, how can we come into God's presence and appeal to him? Especially since, as you and I have seen as we've been reading this, the priesthood have really fallen apart. They've got a bankrupt priesthood. They're honestly, again, this is one interpretive approach, wondering how to come into God's presence because they need him so much at this point. Well, there might be something else, and I want to say that something else maybe for a moment or two, but let's just pose one more overarching question. I see we have a waiting room here. Let's just see what we want to do. Sorry, folks. There we go. Second question, just to be thinking about, because there are those who tend to read this as a kind of rejection of sacrifice in general and emphasizing or overemphasizing good, ethical, moral, righteous behavior with integrity. So obviously, I think you all are going to agree that we want to put those two together. But let's unpack this entrance liturgy, which is what some people call it, just a little bit more. With what shall I come before the Lord? When I bow myself before the God of heaven, should I come with burnt offerings, year-old calves? And let's look at that a little bit. Because obviously we do have, when you read the Psalms, and I've noted for you here Psalm 15, Psalm 24, who can dwell on God's holy hill? Who can stand? Who can ascend to that holy hill? Who can go into God's presence? Those are questions that show up in the Psalms. And when you go back and read those Psalms and others, the focus is going to be the one who has clean hands and a pure heart, operates with integrity, is not deceitful, and so forth. Personal righteousness there. Having said that, the elements that are mentioned by this questioner in this verse are things that were really important for coming into God's holy presence in the tabernacle. So when you read Leviticus 17:11, it's the blood that was important in terms of atonement. Hebrews 9:22, without the shedding of blood, there's no sacrifice for sins. You read on, and Leviticus becomes really important and vibrantly alive. Burnt offerings, Leviticus 1, 3, and 4, were to atone for sin in general, and they were part of an ongoing process, and the whole animal is involved there. And then you can read as well as I can. When you get into year-old calves, these are significant creatures, especially showing up as the priests were ordained. So, you know, whoever's asking this question, hypothetical, however it's being stated, is drawing on elements of the Levitical approach to God. But now it gets interesting, doesn't it? Here's the next one. Does the Lord desire 1,000 rams? Well, you may remember that when we have our kings who are having sacrifices on monumental proportions, thousands of animals are mentioned, but here it's probably a bit of hyperbole. Myriads of streams of oil. And then, should I give my firstborn for my transgression? The fruit of my belly is a sin offering for my soul. In Psalm 106, actually, it's one of those recitals of covenant history, is talking about how at some points they sank to that particular level of doing that kind of sacrifice. So let's come back to the question that I was raising for you a moment ago. Is this sarcasm? Is it the frantic crescendo? Or just another possibility here? Have these people come to grips again, maybe for a very brief time, with what it means that the God Almighty, the Master of heaven and earth, their covenant Lord, has done all those righteous acts on their behalf? As they thought about the history, they remembered it, are they suddenly realizing, you know, there's never enough. Nothing can bring somebody in to God's presence. So we balance these possible interpretations. I kind of like the last one myself, but you don't have to go there. We're going to come back to Amos chapter 5 in a moment, but it's going to raise the same kinds of questions. It's stronger in Amos. Amos, of course, is a prophet speaking to the northern kingdom right before the fall of that northern kingdom. And there the Lord through Amos says, I despise your festivals. And then he talks about justice flowing down. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Here's our verse. the one that I'm guessing you have memorized from somewhere back in your childhood if you grew up in the church. But let's think about it now that we've got that backdrop. He's told you, and I've used the word here, Adam, because that's what's being used, and as I'm going to say in a moment, that seems to suggest all of collective corporate Israel, and then beyond that, obviously, to those who are part of God's people. What does the Lord seek from you? Except doing justice. Now, this next phrase might surprise you a little bit. We probably have memorized it as loving mercy, but I want to be really intentional because it's loving chesed, right? And that second word has so many. It's a one Hebrew word that has about a 5 English word definition. Unfailingly loyal covenant love is what's captured by that word. And through Micah, the Lord is saying, you got to love that kind of attitude, that kind of being, right? Unfailing, loyal, covenant love, and then being humble to walk with your God. What does the Lord seek from us except doing justice? With every fiber of our being, loving this unfailingly loyal covenant love, which is not only God's love for his people, but as we learn in the book of Ruth and other places as well, the way we're to love one another as well, and then being humble to walk with God. Well, first point, he has told you. This doesn't come as news to them, does it? He's told you. He's told you what is good. They should know. And goodness, of course, is a very general word, but I'm referencing, and we could reference many, many passages, but Psalm 100 verse 5 is so nice. For the Lord is good. His chesed everlasting, his truthfulness or faithfulness endures to all generations. And we're supposed to mirror that, basically. If they want to know how to come into God's presence, well, that's going to be a major part of it, isn't it? Doing justice, loving faithfully. And I've just helped us visually establish a link between unfailingly loyal covenant love and this word chesed, which I'm going to use from this point on as opposed to that rather unwieldy description. That pretty much summarizes the relationship. It's that balance, God's justice, God's unfailingly loyal covenant love. We're supposed to have that balance in everything that we are as well, because it's not there in God's people. Obviously, God's going to go ahead and rebuke them. Humbly walk with your God is a very interesting expression. Again, it's one we've memorized, but just kind of an interesting note. We really come to understand the meaning of that word from its only other use in the Hebrew Bible. And you can look up Proverbs 11 verse 2, but there it's put in opposition to pride. Pride comes before disgrace, right? But with this word comes wisdom. And so probably it has something to do with humility, and certainly, well, maybe not certainly, but I want to suggest to you that the person who has been asked, the hypothetical person who's been asking the question in the preceding verses, what shall I come? What shall I do? What shall I do to come into God's presence? Maybe this is just a gentle thing. It's not going to be so much what you do. It's going to be walking humbly with God and then doing everything to mirror who God is in our being. Well, we don't have a lot of time usually, but let's just do this. This is a kind of summarizing the kinds of things I've tried to say so far. I would suggest that the response in verse 8 is not in any way designed to dismiss what's been going on in verses 6 and 7. So I don't think those questions are being dismissed. Just a reminder, it's interesting to me that as Jesus was saying some pretty strong things about the Pharisees, he doesn't say dismiss tithing, and by the way, dill, mint, and cumin are kind of small. But he doesn't dismiss those, doesn't dismiss them at all, but he does emphasize that justice, mercy, and faithfulness need to be so important. In the interest of time, I'm not going to turn to Amos 5, but you can go back and review that in terms of its description of highly emotional ceremonies, apparently, but in that case, they were vacuums. 2 weeks ago, I asked you to think about memorizing. And remember, now we've been admonished in this passage to remember, to remember, to remember. So here it is again. And just, we won't take time, but I would say put this on your radar screen. And if you haven't memorized it yet, it is a wonderful way to draw together the lessons that we tried to pick up in chapter 4 of Micah, i.e., we get to go forth from Zion, bearing the Torah, being living epistles. Here's how we do it. We ask God to teach us his way, that we may walk in his truth. And then the closure on that verse is, notice it comes in 3s. Unite my heart to fear your name. And that, of course, is a transition to what's going to show up in the next verse. Verse 9. Here's where Hebrew gets a little interesting, so bear with me. One of the things that's always kind of challenging, when somebody says the Hebrew is difficult, we often tend to focus on the difficulties. And what I'm going to try and walk with us here is to say, here's what we can say. And by the way, what we can say is really worth listening to. So even though I want to honestly point out difficulties, for example, in this verse, the voice of the Lord will call to the city with sound wisdom. Somebody will fear or see your name. I kind of like the understanding of fear there. And then one translation, hero tribe, and then assembly of the city, or heed the rod and the one who appointed it. My goodness, how do we do that? Well, again, don't worry about that, because we can say some things here. The voice of the Lord is calling, and they're supposed to listen. They're supposed to listen really carefully. And what's coming next is going to be some pretty severe accusations. And it should stop them in their tracks, because obviously there are consequences, and God's going to talk about the consequences for their behavior. So even though there's some difficulties here, our main takeaway from these next verses is the challenge to not slip away, which we do so easily, from doing justice and loving chesed. 3 verses of accusations, and then a few more after that, and then we'll unpack these. So as you look at this, look at the underlined stuff. The difficulties are in italics. Don't worry about the italics. Look at the underlined stuff. That's the stuff we can walk away with. They've been stashing up, apparently, stores, probably ill-gotten gain, if you want to go with a Proverbs understanding of this. They've been cheating, seems, that scanty measure called the ephah. They've been cheating in terms of weights and measures, deceitful stones. And add on to that, violence. We saw that in chapters 2 and 3. Deceit, 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 and treachery. Those are things that are very sobering, and God is saying, they don't wash with me. I'm going to skip that because I'm looking at our clock, which is always an enemy. We say that every week, but this is a terrible, terrible contrast to the lofty aspirations of verse 8. Just kind of a historical note again, when we looked at that chart, the historical backdrop, we saw the name Uzziah. We know Uzziah was a good king, and we know that things went economically really well, politically really well. But you know, whenever you have a good economy, there's always shady characters that are going to deal with it the wrong way. And so very clearly in those verses we just looked at, there have been shady dealings. Short measures, the short ephah, dishonest scales, that's what you have, a bag of deceitful weights, and you've got scales that are not going the right way. Proverbs 11:1 says, dishonest scales are an abomination to the Lord, but the just weight is his delight. And of course, you can see these over and over again in Proverbs. Jerusalem, full of violence, deceit, treachery. Speaking of abominations to the Lord, not only is deceit, cheating, treachery, and commerce an abomination to him, but so is lying. And of course, as you read Proverbs, that's a steady, steady drumbeat throughout the book of Proverbs. Here's the next 3 verses. God's going on with the charge. And by the way, I've got those pronouns highlighted because the Hebrew repeats them in a way. I won't go into a Hebrew grammar lesson here, but there's an emphasis. I, God speaking, have done this because of your sin. As a result, you, emphatic, you're going to eat. You won't be satisfied. You're going to reach, try and overtake, probably security, but you won't be brought into security. I'm going to give you over the sword. You, and this is an agricultural context, you're going to sow. You're not going to reap. You'll tread the olive. You won't be able to use the oil. New wine, you're not going to drink the wine. So in their context, which was agriculturally based, the commerce was agriculturally based, they are going to suffer these kinds of consequences. And God is saying, you have done it. This is what I'm going to do. To summarize that, God is the judge. The judgments that he's putting out in the context of the covenant. And again, Leviticus 26 is sort of our consummate statement of blessings on the one hand, chastisements on the other, echoed again in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. So enemies overrunning the country, well, they were experiencing that at this point in time when Micah was living. Famine, going to be the result. All those agricultural things we mentioned. Any expectations of economic flourishing dashed, whole economy gutted, productivity ground to a halt. That certainly has some interesting echoes in terms of where we are right now in a whole different scene. Don't have time to go there. Just a quick note, because we want to draw some of our lessons about Omri and Ahab as well. Generally, we speak of treading grapes. Here, it's treading olives instead of using an olive press. Those of you who know olives know that they're probably not going to tread all that easily because it's a much more substantial thing. In fact, here's how you did olives. You put the olives into these depressions and ran stones around on them. But Micah is saying you're going to tread the olives. Well, moving along quite quickly. Our closing verse in segments. We're going to do it in segments. Notice my fine print here. As you read the first part of this verse, the irony is horrifying. The statutes of Omri have been kept, and every deed of the house of Ahab, you've walked according to their counsel. Are you catching that? They've disregarded God's statutes and his precepts and his ordinances and the commandments, but they've been happily walking in the ways of the house of Ahab. That's awful. If you look at that map in the yellow rectangle, you see just a little arrow. And this, by the way, is a map talking about Omri and Ahab, especially in the northern kingdom stuff going on. But I want you to look at that arrow that is moving from east to west, and it looks like a really short distance. But believe me, when Omri moved his capital to that western place where the point of that arrow is, a place called Samaria, he was doing something incredibly strategic. And it runs like this. It has geopolitical, socioeconomic, and religious implications. So again, a distance move, miles, kilometers, not really far. A cultural shift, radical, because what Omri does is establish connections with Phoenicia and anybody else more cosmopolitan out to the west. The Omri dynasty is wealthy. Ivories, houses, winter palaces, summer palaces. Amos talks about these things. You can look those up. Amos is going to make pronouncements against that kind of opulence. And then, of course, in that context, Jezebel, who is the daughter of Ethbaal from Phoenicia, brings Baal worship. It's not that Baal worship was new, but now they basically import it as the state religion. All that's part of the fabric of this final accusation in this chapter. You have followed the statutes of Omri. You've done everything according to the house of Ahab. And just a reminder that even in a personal way, you'll remember that Ahab got a little sulky and petulant because he couldn't have Naboth's vineyard. And we suggested that Micah chapter 2 actually alludes to that without naming him, is probably alluding to that incident as well. And just a reminder that when you go back and read 1 Kings 21, it's Jezebel who's been engineering this whole thing. It's not a good scene. It's a recipe for disaster, and therefore the closure is absolutely sobering. The Lord speaking, I'm giving you over to destruction, your inhabitants to hissing. You will bear the reproach of my people. And as I said, the chapter closes with my people. Destruction, humiliation, my people. I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing that we are technically at the end of our hour, but let me run a couple of closing reflections past you. And then if anybody wants to chime in, please do. I know we've run through a lot at this point. But above all, there is an admonition to us, I think, to remember, to memorize, to remember and know. Remember, God said, my people know. I've told them what's good. Remember and know. And of course, the backside of that is how quickly we forget God's faithfulness. That's the beauty of singing about God's faithfulness. We'll remember it a little bit better. Again, maybe that's why Miriam is mentioned. And however you interpret those questions from the people, I would at least suggest this is a bit of a takeaway. Even a small, fleeting glimpse of God's holy presence and his righteous acts and all those things. Oh, how we come back to our need for atonement. If you heard Mark Booker's Ascension Day homily, we have an intercessor. How we need that intercessor. The lesson we can come back with. Clearly, the last part of this chapter makes it really evident that the wider cultural values are so enticing. So enticing. We've read some of them. It's so easy to slip into those patterns, and we have to fight against them, that we not land in destructive and self-serving patterns. This is not in any way intended to be an exhaustive list of lessons, but hopefully there's a few, and I would certainly invite you to think of more on your own. I'm looking at the time, and I guess rather than asking for some feedback, let me close in prayer, and then we can all get ready for the 11 o'clock service. Let's pray together. Our Father, help us to remember. Help us to put on the full armor of God, your armor that we so need. Arm us with your word. Fill us with your spirit. Teach us your way. Help us to walk in your truth. And indeed, we pray for each one of us in this coming week that you would unite our hearts to fear your name. In the mighty name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right, God's blessings to you all. And let's say farewell.
Okay. Thanks, Elaine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's my goodbye wave.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're all welcome.
Bye.
Lord's blessings.
Thank you.